Unit 1, Lesson 7, The American Revolution. So this is a story many of us know. We all remember how the story begins. Colonists set out for a life-changing adventure. They take a ship across the pond, the Atlantic Ocean, and land on the North American shores. They set up colonies that eventually turn into towns and then cities as they begin expanding. They begin farming, starting in trades, having families, and by 1750, more than 1 million people populate those original 13 colonies. But the Enlightenment is stirring these settlers when talks of autonomy, individual rights, and liberty are being discussed. Talks of representation spread rapidly through the colonies, and thus begins the American Revolution. So how did the ideals of the Enlightenment lead to revolutions? Some of the leaders of the American Revolution were influenced by Enlightenment ideas, which were freedom of speech and equality, freedom of the press, and religious tolerance. American colonists did not have these rights, so as a result, they rebelled against England and the monarchy for independence. So, how Americans were inspired for revolution through the Enlightenment was that the Enlightenment saw people trying to apply the scientific approach to aspects of society. Political scientists proposed new ideas about how government should work, and philosophers they advocated for the use of reason to discover truths and to address social issues through reason. Enlightenment writers challenged many accepted ideas about government and society, and these ideas swept through European society and to colonial America. This led colonists to declare independence, defeating Britain and establishing our own American Republic. Some of those Enlightenment thinkers that helped lead to the American Revolution were Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that citizens had a social contract with their government, and that the government, just the same as the citizens, both had to honor their side of that agreement. And of course, John Locke, who believed that all men are born with natural rights, and that citizens can revolt from tyrannical governments who are not helping affirm individuals' natural rights. One other Enlightenment thinker whose work weighed heavily on the American colonists and revolutionaries was Montesquieu and his separation of powers, or the system of checks and balances. Montesquieu's writing on the separation of powers, and specifically the system of checks and balances, is enshrined in our Constitution in America, where there's three main branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, and each of them serve as a check on the other two. And taxation without representation became one of the main launching points for the American Revolution, when in 1764 Parliament in Britain set a tax on sugar and molasses imported into the colonies, which impacted the manufacture of rum, among other things, in New England. The Sugar Act also taxed additional foreign goods, including wines and coffee. A year later, in 1765, Parliament in Britain imposed the Stamp Act on the colonies. Now, this act required certain printed materials, such as legal documents and newspapers, to carry a stamp showing a tax had to be paid to Britain for the right to have that paper. Although colonists were not happy about the sugar tax, it was the Stamp Act tax and the opposition that was so widespread and often violent. And finally, the Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonies to house British soldiers in barracks provided by the colonies. This required the American colonists to provide food, drink, lodging quarters, fuel, and transportation to British forces stationed in their towns or villages, all without the equal rights of representation in British Parliament. So by 1776, American colonists were divided usually into three groups. Around 40% of American colonists were neutralists. They were undecided about which side to choose. 40% were patriots who supported separation from Britain. They were basically the true first Americans. And then another 20% were loyalists who wanted to remain part of the British system and remain a British colony. This leads us to the Boston Massacre, shown here in an artist's rendition of the event. As we saw in the pie chart, by July of 1776, enough Americans were patriots that members of the Second Continental Congress formed a five-man committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, which went on to state, amongst other things, that all men are born with natural rights of life, liberty, and property, showing that citizens can break their social contract with their government when their government becomes tyrannical and isn't operating in their best interests. The Declaration of Independence was based on the Enlightened ideas and explained in detail exactly why the colonists were rebelling. At the end of a long and bitter war, the American Revolutionary War, Great Britain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, effectively ending the American Revolution. This treaty gave America full independence and all territory east of the Mississippi River between Canada and Florida. It also allowed for the removal of all British soldiers from the United States. The significance of the American Revolution in that it wasn't the first time in history a people overthrew a tyrannical monarchy. That had happened before, and it would happen again after. However, it was the ideas that were created out of the revolution that were unique. It was the first revolution that was driven by an Enlightenment ideal, seeking a representative democracy, following in the footsteps of the ancient Greek democracies that we've learned about.